So, I've been an RN at a general hospital for about 3 years now. It's one of the toughest, although yet rewarding jobs I've had while assisting people in serious conditions. Most of the time, you'd pretty much be caring for patients and administering medication for them. We've had several people come in on late nights complaining about fibromyalgia and other common conditions that could easily be treated at home. I'd often deal with these types of people just by giving them simple over-the-counter medication if they had insurance. However, there were a few times where you'd have to treat patients who were in actual need. Treating patients not only makes you feel rewarded, but you also sometimes develop a bond with them. This story has the same principle. One time, I had cared for an elderly woman whose husband just died and was admitted to the hospital from a severe bacterial infection. Her name was Kate, and she was the sweetest little lady you could ever meet and would always tell us stories about her animals she used to own. She always loved animals and used them as a sort of coping mechanism. However, other than service animals, the hospital wouldn't allow any other pets, which made her profoundly sad. I felt so bad for her, as ever since she had arrived, she was also kind to us regardless of what she was dealing with. Over the past week or so, I really started to develop an emotional connection with her, so I would always be sure to show her extra attention. It was wholesome, but as a nurse, it's our responsibility to be there for patients. One day, she looked at me nearly crying and thanked me for all I've done for her. This utterly shocked me and left me in complete disbelief as I soon began to realize what she meant by that. She passed away a day later, and I cried for nearly a week. The other nurses were sad, but not as much as I was, seeing as I was one of the people she truly cared for. Weeks went by, and I simply moved on from her. She'd oftentimes pop in my head every now and then, but I mostly moved forward as being a nurse was busy. One night, I was speaking with one of my colleagues by the front desk about a patient's chart when she told me to get a piece of equipment from the basement. The basement of the hospital is where we usually keep our equipment and other medical supplies for storage. They aren't common in most hospitals, but they exist. It's very rare for one of us to go down to the basement, so this meant that we needed something pretty important. So I take the elevator all the way down to the basement and turn on the lights when I get this eerie feeling. I've been in the basement many times, and I've never had a feeling like this. To best describe it, it felt like a sense of dread coming from somewhere in here, but I wasn't sure where. To be fair, basements are creepy, especially the ones from a hospital. I go down this little hallway we have and grab the equipment sitting on one of the shelves when I could have sworn I heard footsteps behind me. However, they didn't sound like someone with shoes, but rather barefoot. I figure it's one of my coworkers playing a joke in an attempt to scare me. However, instead of getting mad, I thought I'd backfire their plan and catch them in the act. I walk out of the room and back out into the main area where I don't see anyone. At some point, I yell out, "Hello? Anyone else in here?" As expected, however, I get no response, which only wanted to make me leave faster. At this point, I'm questioning if it was just sounds from the electrical panels, and with that, I make my way over to the elevator. As I'm about halfway there, I hear clear as day the voice of an old woman shout my name from down the hall.
Sarah!
It only took me a good second to realize that it sounded like none other than Kate. I can say with certainty that I'm officially creeped the hell out, and I hurried back to my station. I didn't bother telling anyone about it, thinking they'd think I'm crazy. However, I know what I heard. It sounded too real for me to be imagining it. The only other person I told was a nurse who I had worked with only because she was one of the people who I trusted dearly. Based on my expression while telling her, I think she believed there was some truth to it, as she seemed to fully understand. Needless to say, that was my last time going down into the basement. Whenever I get asked to go down to the basement again, I always get another person to do it. Every time someone else did it, I'd always get looks, but quite frankly, I don't care. I've never believed in the paranormal, but I still have no explanation for this. This happened during the summer of 2015 when I was around 17. I have valve disease, a disease where one of the valves in your heart stops functioning properly, which results in a loss of blood flow. The reason I was in the hospital was because of me being a dumbass and letting my condition go untreated. Therefore, I was dealing with extreme chest pain. Yeah, not fun. Anyway, I was spending the night in the hospital hooked up to an IV filled with medicine to help me breathe better. If I could remember correctly, it was around 10, and my parents had just left since visiting hours were over. This was my first time spending the night in a hospital alone, so I was naturally nervous. To pass time, I read a book when I eventually got tired and decided to call it a night. Right then and there, I fall asleep for a good 2 hours or so when I for some reason wake up. I was immediately awoke with the sound of the buzzing light from out in the hall, where I then hear something else. The sound of footsteps can be heard coming from down the hall and approaching my room fast. At first, I thought it was the night nurse coming to check on me, but I instead saw some guy I had never seen before look into my room. He appeared to be a dad, or maybe a visitor, but he wasn't my dad. He wore a white shirt, camo pants, and some glasses. I was obviously confused, but I didn't feel threatened or afraid, as I'm sure he was probably lost. In a very direct tone, I say hello, and he looks around nervously before putting his finger to his lips, making a hushing sound. He then takes out a pair of what looked like gardening shears from his back pocket and moves toward me. I would have just tried to run, but my energy was at an all-time low due to my condition, so I couldn't even if I tried. He then moves forward until he's at the edge of my bed, where he cuts the IV cord. Sparks come flying out to the point where the room lit up for a second. The machine obviously stopped working, where I was on the verge of having a full-on panic attack. This made my symptoms even worse, causing me to have constant shortness of breath. After that, he simply got up and left the room so casually as if nothing had happened. Without any hesitation, I used any energy I could to call out for anyone else who might have been on this floor. There was only one nurse on this floor, but she had been assisting over 20 plus rooms. I stayed in that room nearly half an hour, having trouble breathing since the medication was cut off. Thankfully, the night nurse had came, and when she saw what happened to my IV, she freaked out. She immediately called for security and a few other nurses to transport me to another room. I remember the hospital conducting an investigation with police to try and find the person who did this. I gave them a description of what he looked like, but there was nobody in the hospital who matched that. Surprisingly, as nice as this hospital was, it didn't have a camera near the area I was in, only one from down the hall. Eventually, however, they did manage to catch the person in another building of the hospital walking around. The camera footage showed him going into several rooms for a few seconds only to walk right out. Why I was the one he specifically targeted is unclear, as he didn't appear to do anything when he went into the other rooms. I have no idea who he was or why he did what he did, as the hospital wouldn't give us an update. I thank those hospital workers for acting quick and getting me to another room. It still scares me to wonder what would have happened had I been asleep when he cut that cord. I remember my parents on the phone with police and the hospital about any information, but I was never told anything about the man, and I'm not sure I ever will. I haven't seen him since, but I just hope he's behind bars. Before I begin with my story, I want to point out that this isn't the type of story to have you on the edge of your seat type of story. It is, however, the creepiest and most bizarre thing I've ever seen. For some context, I work as an entry-level nurse practitioner at a relatively large hospital in downtown Chicago. Most of the time, I'd be really busy during the day, but once night came, I didn't really have much to do. This was because I was working in a part of the hospital where much didn't go on. One night, I had been with one of my coworkers not doing anything besides playing a few iMessage games. As we're fooling around, we begin to hear another one of our colleagues yelling from down the hall. Of course, we run towards him and see that he's screaming into one of the empty rooms. He keeps on screaming while talking about someone in the room. At first, it was hard to understand, but he kept on insisting to us not to go in that room. It was beyond abnormal, as it came to a point where it seemed he was utterly scared by something. My coworker and I checked that room, but had found no one, as the last person who was in there was discharged last week. Eventually, hospital security had escorted him out, and he even got tested for drugs. However, he came back clean, and nobody was able to figure out who or what made him behave like that. He ended up taking a week off of work and came back completely normal. Needless to say, this was the creepiest thing I've ever witnessed while working. It wasn't until a few weeks later where other people began to experience similar episodes. It even came to a point where this happened to 2 other people, one of them being a visitor. Eventually, that entire floor of the hospital was closed off, and upper management has been silent about it. This world is strange, and nobody can seem to figure out what has been happening till this day.